In January 1066, King Edward the Confessor dies without a biological heir. The English throne sits completely empty, creating a dangerous power vacuum. Three ambitious men immediately scramble to claim the crown. From within England, the powerful noble Harold Godwinson. From the north, the Norwegian king Harold Hardrode. And across the Channel in France, Duke William of Normandy. Godwinson moves first, seizing the throne. But almost as soon as he takes power, he receives word that Norwegian forces have landed in Yorkshire. He forces his army into a 185-mile march north to meet the threat head-on. The two armies collide at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Godwinson's troops overwhelmed the Norwegian invaders, killing Hardrode and temporarily securing the northern border. But the timing of this victory leaves Harold vulnerable. While his men are recovering from the fight, Duke William's fleet lands 250 miles away on the southern coast of England. Godwinson is forced to turn his army around and march back immediately. On October 14th, the two armies meet near Hastings. Godwinson's men lock their shields together on a ridge, forming a defensive wall. Below them wait William's well-rested Norman knights on horseback. For 9 hours, the combat is relentless. William's cavalry repeatedly charges, attempting to break the English shields. Eventually, the lines fracture. Harold Godwinson is killed. Without their king, the Anglo-Saxon infantry collapses, leaving the Normans in command. To mark this victory, William orders a massive stone abbey built exactly where Harold fell. The altar is placed directly over where the English king died. William has the crown, but his position is precarious. He is a French-speaking foreigner commanding a few thousand soldiers, surrounded by an estimated 2 million hostile English subjects. Defeating an army in a single afternoon was only the beginning. To prevent a massive uprising, William realized he had to build a system of structural domination designed to physically contain the nation. The primary tool for this occupation was architectural. The Normans introduced the castle to England not just as a fort, but as a mechanism designed to project royal authority over the conquered landscape. On the coast, structures like Dover Castle served as unbreakable strongholds. These towering walls secured the English Channel, guaranteeing William a safe supply line back to his territories in France. In London, a city prone to rebellion, William built the White Tower. To the native English, this looming, pale stone monolith was a constant reminder of the foreign presence. Prior to the invasion, Anglo-Saxon defenses were mostly made of wood and earth. The Normans replaced these with permanent stone fortresses that could not be easily burned or breached by local insurgents. Scattered across the countryside, these stone garrisons allowed a tiny minority of Norman occupiers to police a massive population. The foreign elite no longer needed to live among the English. They could rule them from the safety of high walls. But stone alone could not govern a nation. In 1086, William commissioned an administrative tool that was equally effective at controlling the population, the Domesday Book. Royal officials were sent to every corner of the realm to catalog everything of value. They recorded the dimensions of every plot of land, counted every pig, and tallied every peasant living in every village. This data allowed William to systematically dispossess English landowners, legally reassigning wealth from the native population to his own Norman knights. This formed the basis of feudalism. The king held ultimate ownership of all land, leasing it to his barons in exchange for military service. The barons, in turn, extracted labor and taxes from the peasants tied to the soil. The combination of the Domesday Survey and the castle network created a level of administrative control previously unknown in England. For the first time, the central government had the exact data needed to tax every village and the physical presence to enforce it. In 1120, the White Ship struck a rock in the English Channel and sank, drowning the only legitimate male heir to King Henry I. Henry attempted to secure the succession by forcing his barons to swear oaths of loyalty to his daughter, Matilda. But when the king died in 1135, many of the lords broke their promises. The barons crowned Henry's nephew, Stephen, instead. In response, Matilda gathered loyalist forces and launched a military campaign to reclaim the throne. The Norman machine of state worked effectively under a strong king, but an absolute monarchy relies entirely on a clear line of succession. Once that line was severed, the entire apparatus failed. With Stephen and Matilda deadlocked in a war for the crown, central authority evaporated. England descended into a lawless civil war known as the Anarchy. Without a king to enforce the law, the feudal barons exploited the vacuum. Lords who were previously loyal administrators transformed into independent regional warlords. These rogue barons began constructing adulterine castles. Built without permission, these illegal fortresses served as staging grounds for lords to wage private wars. The native population bore the cost of this breakdown. Peasant communities were caught in the crossfire of warring nobles, and many were forced into slave labor to build the very castles used to terrorize them. William the Conqueror proved that a nation could be systematically occupied by building an immovable network of stone walls, but the anarchy revealed the inherent risk of that strategy. Without a unified king to hold the keys, the castles designed to secure the realm became the very tools used to fragment it. In the 12th century, legal authority functioned as a physical extension of the crown. The monarch lived outside the reach of the law. His personal will was the final, unchallengeable rule for his subjects. When Henry II took the throne in 1154, he inherited a landscape fractured by years of civil war. He ruled the Angevin Empire, a massive territory stretching from the borders of Scotland across the English Channel to the Pyrenees in southern France. Governing an empire of this scale through military force alone was impossible. Instead, Henry pioneered a different strategy, replacing the brute force of local garrisons with the quiet, centralized control of a royal bureaucracy. He standardized regional legal traditions into common law and created the Grand Assize of 1179. This introduced traveling royal justices and gave citizens the option to choose a jury trial over the traditional brutality of trial by combat. These reforms pulled authority away from independent local lords and funneled it directly into the king's hands. Henry had successfully turned the legal system into an efficient weapon of state control. But absolute centralization generated intense political friction, especially with independent institutions like the Catholic Church. This friction turned lethal in 1170. Acting on the king's anger, 4 royal knights entered Canterbury Cathedral and brutally assassinated the Archbishop, Thomas Becket. To maintain his geopolitical dominance, Henry also had to engage in near-constant warfare, placing a heavy and continuous financial burden on the kingdom. Henry had built a perfect machine for absolute control, but it contained a lethal flaw. The entire system relied on the personal competence and restraint of the monarch operating it. That flaw became a crisis in 1199 when John took the throne. He inherited the massive debts of his predecessor and quickly lost most of his family's continental lands, including Normandy, to the French. This territorial loss caused a total financial panic. With his income from France gone, John desperately searched for new ways to pull revenue out of his English subjects to fund his failing wars. John perverted the efficient legal machine built by his father, turning the royal courts into tools of extortion. He used his authority to impose arbitrary fines on anyone with the wealth to pay. He aggressively abused scutage, a fee normally paid in lieu of military service. John demanded extortionate scutage payments for his barons even when he wasn't actively fighting, effectively draining the kingdom's elite of their liquid wealth. By using the law to bleed his subjects dry, John destroyed the core feudal contract of mutual loyalty and reciprocal obligation. These policies alienated everyone of consequence, eventually leading to a dispute with Pope Innocent III and John's temporary excommunication. In 1215, the nobility reached their breaking point. Enraged by John's capricious rule, the barons renounced their loyalty to the crown and marched their forces against the king. The turning point came in May 1215, when the rebels successfully seized the city of London, cutting the king off from his capital and treasury. With his capital lost and an overwhelming rebel army closing in, the King of England was physically trapped and legally forced to negotiate. On June 15, 1215, the two armies met at a neutral meadow called Runnymede to negotiate a peace treaty. The original 1215 Magna Carta was a narrow, tactical document designed solely to safeguard the property and status of the aristocracy, ignoring the modern perception of the text as a universal Bill of Rights. It was a pragmatic settlement aimed at ending a civil war by protecting the interests of the elite, and it completely ignored the unfree peasant majority that actually made up the nation. Yet buried in the text was a radical new rule. The king could only raise taxes with the explicit consent of the realm. It also codified a primary legal principle. The monarch was now subject to the law of the land. By putting these rules in writing, the barons successfully used the king's own system of legal bureaucracy to place a permanent limit on his authority. As a peace treaty, Magna Carta failed immediately. John convinced the Pope to annul it within weeks, sparking the First Barons' War. The war escalated quickly, with Prince Louis of France leading an invasion and brutal sieges taking place at loyalist strongholds like Dover Castle. But an accident of history changed everything. John died unexpectedly in 1216. To win back the rebels, the regents of his 9-year-old son strategically reissued the Magna Carta. This desperate wartime reissue cemented the document into history, permanently transforming the law from the king's weapon into the king's cage. In 1215, rebel barons forced King John to accept a peace treaty. This document outlined a legal pact to limit his authority, but John convinced the Pope to annul the charter. The written promises evaporated, plunging England into civil war. The following year, John died suddenly of dysentery. The crown, and the war to defend it, fell to his 9-year-old son, Henry III. To survive the crisis, Henry's regents needed to pacify the rebel faction. They reissued the Magna Carta, signaling that the boy king would rule in cooperation with his barons. That cooperation ended when Henry reached adulthood. He abandoned the arrangement and used his royal prerogative to arbitrarily increase fines and taxes, draining the wealth of the barons to finance failed military campaigns in France. The trust in the monarchy's word had eroded. The baronage concluded that reissued charters were insufficient. They required a permanent, institutional structure capable of forcing the sovereign to obey the law of the land. In 1258, a coalition of barons forced Henry to accept the provisions of Oxford. This framework placed the monarchy under the direct supervision of a representative baronial council. When Henry resisted these constraints, conflict erupted into the Second Barons' War. In 1265, rebel leader Simon de Montfort convened an assembly that intentionally included knights from the shires and burgesses from the towns. By including these representatives, de Montfort expanded political participation beyond the traditional feudal elite. This specific assembly established the structural blueprint for a representative legislative body. The crown responded with overwhelming military force. Royalist armies launched massive operations, like the 1266 siege of Kenilworth Castle, to systematically destroy the baronial resistance. De Montfort was killed and the rebellion was defeated, but the mechanism he utilized had survived. The crown had seen that an expanded assembly could effectively mobilize the political community, a tool future monarchs would find necessary to adopt. Henry's successor, Edward I, was a ruthless pragmatist. He launched aggressive military campaigns to conquer Wales and Scotland, an objective that required the construction of vast, expensive military infrastructure. To finance these wars, Edward institutionalized the parliamentary system. He summoned parliaments regularly, utilizing the representatives of the shires and boroughs to secure nationwide consent for heavy taxation. This demand for wealth drove a brutal domestic policy. Edward heavily exploited minority populations for revenue, culminating in the permanent expulsion of England's entire Jewish community in 1290. The military dominance purchased by Edward I collapsed under his son. In 1314, Edward II suffered a catastrophic defeat by Scottish forces at the Battle of Bannockburn, damaging the myth of English royal invincibility. 12 years later, Edward II was deposed by his own queen and her allies. A sitting English monarch had been removed by force, proving that the crown relied entirely on the continued tolerance of the realm's political elites. This chart shows the total population of England during the 14th century. In 1348, the bubonic plague struck. Within 6 years, the population was plummeting by nearly 50%. When we overlay average wages onto this timeline, the correlation is clear. The massive death toll created an immediate labor shortage. Surviving peasant workers suddenly held extreme leverage, and their labor value spiked. The crown reacted by passing the Statute of Laborers in 1351. This law was designed to artificially freeze wages at pre-plague levels and strictly bind peasants back to their lords. Decades of enforcing these artificial economic controls built enormous social friction. It finally ignited in 1381 with the Peasants' Revolt. Led by Wat Tyler, common laborers marched on London to demand an end to serfdom and the feudal system itself. The rebellion was suppressed, but the underlying system was irreparably broken. The economic leverage discovered during the plague turned the commons into a volatile political force that the crown could no longer ignore. The stability of the monarchy fractured again in 1399. King Richard II was forcefully deposed and replaced by his cousin, Henry IV, thrusting the English crown into a crisis of legitimacy. While Henry V temporarily unified the country through military victories, his successor, Henry VI, proved politically incapable. Under his rule, England lost its French territories, and the royal treasury faced bankruptcy. Without strong central leadership to mediate disputes, rival aristocratic factions began raising private armies. By 1455, this vacuum of authority escalated into the Wars of the Roses. For 3 decades, the rival houses of York and Lancaster waged destructive military campaigns, seeking to eradicate each other's claim to the throne. The fighting was marked by political executions and battlefield slaughter that systematically wiped out the older, entrenched medieval nobility. The most powerful rivals to the crown simply killed each other off. With the regional warlords decimated, power defaulted back to the central state. Future monarchs could no longer rely on a network of noble bloodlines to secure their rule. They had to rely on the administrative machinery of the government itself. The factional warfare ended at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. The Plantagenet dynasty ended in the mud, and Henry Tudor claimed the throne. Henry VII took the throne in an era where the unchecked personal authority of his predecessors had been ground away. The crown was now part of a system that required negotiation with the realm's representatives. Parliament matured from emergency councils into a permanent legislative engine with its own procedures, records, and a fixed seat of power at Westminster. The state could not function without it. To legally raise taxes, wage foreign wars, or pass binding statutes, the crown required the institutional consent of the House of Commons. Over 2.5 centuries, England endured catastrophic plague, the deposition of kings, and relentless civil war. Through this friction between the sovereign and the subjects, a structured, power-sharing government was violently but permanently born. In the late 15th century, the English nobility was tearing itself apart. Decades of civil conflict had left the country fractured and bleeding. The medieval monarchy was inherently weak. To maintain order, the crown relied entirely on the loyalty and the private armies of powerful, warring feudal lords. When Henry Tudor claimed the throne at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, he inherited this volatile system. He understood immediately that relying on the goodwill of wealthy barons would inevitably lead to his own death. Henry's goal was to neutralize the men who could overthrow him. Every administrative reform he enacted was aimed at ensuring his own dynastic survival. His first move was defensive. By marrying Elizabeth of York, he united the 2 warring factions of the Civil War, cutting off immediate rival claims to the throne. He then turned his attention to the feudal lords. Henry implemented ruthless tax collection policies, confiscating noble wealth to refill an empty royal treasury, while executing any remaining pretenders. Yet this newly centralized control was fragile. The survival of the entire regime depended on a single biological requirement, producing an undisputed male heir to continue the line. The need to secure the Tudor bloodline forced the monarchy into aggressive interventions that would reshape the structure of the English government. That biological vulnerability hit a crisis point with his son, Henry VIII. After years of marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Henry had only a daughter, Mary. He feared the lack of a male heir would plunge England back into a succession war. He requested an annulment from Rome. However, the Pope, pressured by Catherine's powerful Spanish relatives, refused to grant it. Unable to negotiate, Henry bypassed the Vatican entirely. In 1534, Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, declaring the English monarch to be the supreme head of a newly separated Church of England. The English Reformation began as a state intervention to secure a divorce and protect the line of succession, subordinating religion to the legal requirements of the dynasty. Now holding direct authority over the church, the crown moved on its assets. Beginning in the 1530s, the state systematically closed monastic sites across England and Wales, seizing their vast lands and funneling the wealth directly to the royal exchequer. Henry immediately weaponized this wealth to defend against outraged Catholic powers in Europe. He constructed a network of coastal artillery fortresses, like Deal Castle, specifically engineered to deflect cannon fire and repel invasions. To eliminate vulnerabilities on his western flank, Henry formalized the legal annexation of Wales. The Laws in Wales Acts brought the territory fully under English civil law and granted Welshmen parliamentary representation, while simultaneously outlawing the Welsh language in all state court proceedings. By seizing land, fortifying the coast, and enforcing legal uniformity to protect a fragile succession, Henry built the machinery of a centralized state. When Henry died in 1547, the system cracked. His young son, Edward VI, took over, and his Regency Council immediately forced radical Protestant reforms onto the population. But Edward died at just 15. His Catholic half-sister, Mary I, gathered her forces at Framlingham Castle, defeated rival claimants, and rapidly dragged the nation back under the authority of Rome. Mary's attempt to restore Catholicism involved burning nearly 300 Protestants at the stake. She also married the King of Spain, dragging England to a conflict with France that resulted in the permanent loss of Calais, the last English outpost on the continent. A single decade of violent theological swings and leadership crises had nearly undone the entire Tudor project of consolidation. Mary's death in 1558 left the throne to her half-sister, Elizabeth I. She inherited a government that was nearly bankrupt, internationally isolated and divided. She faced the constant threat of a Spanish invasion and dealt with domestic plots organized around her Catholic cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. To prevent the country from tearing itself apart, Elizabeth orchestrated the religious settlement of 1559. It was a calculated political compromise. The state established a church that maintained Protestant theology but retained traditional Catholic aesthetics, forcing a fragile public conformity. By neutralizing religious extremism through state policy, Elizabeth finally secured the domestic peace required to project power outward. That stability was tested in 1588, when Spain launched a massive naval armada to invade England. Elizabeth met her troops here at Tilbury Fort, preparing to defend the borders. The English navy scattered the Spanish fleet. This victory proved the state could survive external aggression, and it broke Spain's dominance over the Atlantic. Protected borders allowed the economy to accelerate. English elites funneled immense capital into grand estates like Hardwicke Hall, and in 1600, the Crown chartered the East India Company, laying the groundwork for global commercial monopolies. The British Empire grew from this century of internal scramble. It was the unintended byproduct of a dynasty enacting defensive laws, seizing monastic lands, and negotiating survival settlements to protect their own status. For centuries, European monarchs operated under the premise that their authority was appointed by God. This divine right meant the king was accountable only to heaven, leaving no room for earthly judgment or legal interference. When James I unified the English and Scottish crowns in 1603, he became the primary advocate for this philosophy, expecting his subjects and courts to treat his word as absolute law. Legal resistance formed around Chief Justice Sir Edward Coke. From the bench of the Common Pleas, Coke began to systematically deny that the king possessed the authority to pass judgment in legal proceedings. Coke reframed this medieval treaty, weaponizing the Magna Carta's ancient Latin script to prove the king's power had fixed limits. By treating it as universal law, these inherent liberties created a protective barrier against royal caprice, rooted in tradition. The friction between a king claiming divine authority and a judiciary asserting the supremacy of law became unsustainable. The ideological deadlock made a violent collision between the two powers a certainty. Charles I regarded Parliament as a stubborn obstacle to his authority, aggressively escalating his father's pursuit of absolute power. After dissolving the legislature, Charles began his 11 years personal rule. He governed England as a lone executive, effectively cutting off the nation's traditional advisory body from the state's finances and policy. To fund his government, Charles revived ship money. Traditionally, for coastal defense, he illegally expanded the tax zone inward, swallowing interior counties. When John Hampden refused to pay, his trial provoked national outrage, proving to the public that the king's reach was now effectively limitless. The king's refusal to be checked by the law forced a realization across England. Peaceful petitions were no longer a viable way to constrain a monarch who believed he was above the law. The system collapsed when Charles attempted to impose Anglican reforms on Scotland, sparking the Bishops' Wars. The resulting financial ruin forced him to recall the parliament he had spent a decade ignoring. This long parliament immediately stripped the king of his leverage. They passed the Triennial Act, mandating that the legislature meet at least every 3 years, with or without the king's invitation. They moved to abolish the Star Chamber, the king's private extra-legal court. Without this tribunal, Charles lost his primary tool for bypassing common law to punish his critics. When Charles illegally raised an army to suppress his opponents in 1642, the nation descended into the English Civil War. The legal debate was over. The matter of sovereignty would be settled by artillery. The war divided England into 2 camps, the Royalist Cavaliers and the Parliamentarian Roundheads. Families split as the country decided whether to fight for the king's prerogative or Parliament's rights. This was the ultimate physical test of the state. The outcome would decide once and for all if the sword or the statute would hold the final authority over the British people. Parliament found its winning edge in the new model army, a professional force commanded by Oliver Cromwell. Their decisive victories at Naseby and Preston effectively destroyed the king's military capacity. In 1649, the Rump Parliament took the radical step of trying King Charles with treason. He was publicly executed outside Whitehall, a moment that signaled the end of the old order in the most violent way possible. The victors immediately abolished the House of Lords and the monarchy itself. England was declared a republic, the Commonwealth, aiming to replace royal rule with a government of the people. But the pendulum swung too far. The republic quickly degraded into a military dictatorship, with Cromwell ruling as Lord Protector. He eventually dissolved the very parliament that had brought him to power. Upon Cromwell's death, the nation was exhausted by decades of ideological and military struggle. In a desperate attempt to return to normalcy, they invited the executed king's son, Charles II, to restore the throne. The era of the Commonwealth had clearly proven that beheading a king was not the same thing as creating liberty. Without a stable, written framework, a power vacuum is inevitably filled by the force of a dictator. The Restoration remained fragile. When the Catholic James II succeeded his brother, his pro-Catholic policies and arbitrary use of royal power threatened to trigger a second civil war. Parliament had learned from the previous generation's mistakes. This time, they bypassed the battlefield and opted for an engineered strategic replacement of the monarch. In 1688, in what became known as the Glorious Revolution, Parliament invited the Protestant William of Orange to England. Faced with a massive Dutch fleet and a defecting army, James II fled without a fight. But there was a catch. William and Mary were only given the crown on the condition that they sign the Declaration of Right, placing the monarchy under permanent legislative control. This bloodless coup established the terms of the modern British state. The king no longer ruled by the unchecked grace of God, but by the expressed permission of the people's representatives. The final victory over absolutism was codified in the Bill of Rights of 1689, transforming informal protections into binding laws. It mandated that no law could be suspended without Parliament's consent, protected free elections, and secured the independence of the legislature. The Act of Settlement in 1701 completed this structure. It permanently established judicial independence, ensuring that judges' salaries and positions were protected from the king's influence. Finally, the Act of Union in 1707 merged the parliaments of England and Scotland, creating a single, unified state. The centuries of dynastic accident were replaced by a formal political union, Great Britain. The violent pendulum swing of the 17th century finally came to rest. It left behind a legacy that informed the governments of future nations, the principle that a state's legitimacy is derived from the consent of the governed, and that no one, not even a king, is above the law. While the rest of Europe exploded into violent revolution, Britain survived the 18th and 19th centuries by acting as a pressure valve, slowly venting political tension before it could tear the state apart. In 1714, the German House of Hanover took the British throne. King George I spoke little English and showed almost zero interest in domestic administration. His disinterest created a power vacuum. To keep the government running, the king delegated his executive authority to a committee of ministers. Robert Walpole capitalized on this arrangement, effectively inventing the role of prime minister, securing power for decades. By accidentally delegating its power, the British monarchy took an unconscious step toward modernization, avoiding the rigid absolutism that would soon doom other European royals. Overseas, the empire was expanding rapidly. Britain won the 7 Years' War, claiming vast new territories, only to lose its American colonies shortly after due to strict, unyielding taxation policies. But a far more severe threat was brewing at home. The Industrial Revolution was tearing up the traditional agrarian economy, driving thousands out of the countryside and into massive new urban manufacturing hubs. The political map, however, had not changed in centuries. Small, depopulated rural areas, rotten boroughs, were completely controlled by wealthy landowners, yet still sent 2 members to Parliament. Meanwhile, exploding industrial behemoths like Manchester and Birmingham housed hundreds of thousands of workers, yet had zero representation. The political system was completely detached from the demographic and economic reality of the nation. Societal pressure was building, with no legal way to release it. Across the English Channel, the French Revolution of 1789 terrified the British elite. They watched a centuries-old monarchy get completely dismantled by its own people. This fear became a direct military threat during the Irish Rebellion of 1798. Prime Minister William Pitt recognized that French forces could link up with Irish rebels, creating a pincer movement that would leave Britain exposed on its western flank. To lock down this vulnerability, Pitt pushed through the Act of Union in 1800. This dissolved the separate Irish Parliament and centralized all legislative power in Westminster, cutting off any chance of a foreign alliance. Parliament enacted these reforms as a shield against foreign contagion, prioritizing state survival over the expansion of democratic rights. Domestically, the situation was deteriorating. The new industrial cities were plagued by extreme overcrowding, deprivation, and rampant disease. The urban working class generated the empire's wealth, enduring hazardous conditions and low wages, while being completely shut out of the political process. This exploitation erupted into violence. Groups like the Luddites sabotaged factory machinery, and by 1831, riots in Bristol left the city in ashes. The British ruling class realized they were staring down the barrel of a bloody French-style revolution right in their own backyards. The Whig government, led by Earl Grey, concluded that the only way to save the British establishment was to reform it. They drafted the Great Reform Act of 1832. The bill faced fierce resistance from the Tory-dominated House of Lords. They viewed it as an attack on their hereditary power and blocked its passage. National riots intensified. Facing a full-blown constitutional crisis, King William IV threatened to flood the House of Lords with newly created Whig peers. Outmaneuvered, the Lords surrendered and let the bill pass. It abolished 56 rotten boroughs, handed seats to industrial towns, and granted voting rights to property-owning middle-class men. By sacrificing a portion of their absolute power, the aristocracy successfully opened the pressure valve, pulling the nation back from the brink of civil war. The Great Reform Act functioned as a calculated compromise, explicitly disenfranchising women and tethering the vote to the ownership of property. This property threshold co-opted the wealthy male class into the establishment, but left the vast majority of industrial workers entirely without a voice. That bitter disappointment directly fueled the Chartist movement in the 1830s and 40s. The working class continued to agitate, organizing mass petitions for universal suffrage and equal representation. While the act did not solve Britain's deep inequality, it shifted the battlefield. The fight moved from armed rebellion in the streets to political petitioning in Parliament. The historical weight of the Great Reform Act lies in the precedent it set. It proved the British Constitution was flexible and that the ruling elite would peacefully surrender power when pushed to the edge. This chart shows the British electorate in 1832, a blueprint for peaceful democratization, though voters remained a small fraction of the population. By 1867 and 1884, subsequent reform acts enfranchised urban workers and rural laborers, ultimately tripling the electorate. By treating constitutional reform as a pressure valve, Britain navigated the volatile forces of global empire and industry, evolving into a representative democracy without a single guillotine falling. France, Russia, America. Each of these nations reached a point in their history where the pressure of governance became too great and their political systems shattered. They experienced a year zero, a violent revolution that wiped the slate clean and entirely rewrote the rules of the state. But if you look at the British state over the last 300 years, you do not find a year zero. It survived continuous global war, economic crashes, and massive social upheaval, not because its institutions were unyielding, but because it mastered the art of reluctant adaptation. The United Kingdom operates without a single codified constitution. Instead, it relies on a historical cycle of crisis and concession. When domestic or external pressure builds, the unwritten system acts as a political shock absorber. It bends just enough to release the tension, avoiding a total snap. To understand how this state functions today, we have to look back at the historical brinks it almost stepped over and the last-minute deals that kept it intact. In 1714, the British monarchy faced a severe mechanical failure. King George I ascended to the throne to secure a Protestant succession, but he barely spoke English and had little interest in the day-to-day administration of domestic policy. This created an immediate vacuum of executive control. 6 years later, that vacuum became a crisis when the South Sea bubble burst. It was a catastrophic market crash that wiped out fortunes and threatened the financial solvency of the entire country. The nation faced total economic ruin, and there was no functioning executive to manage the fallout. To prevent collapse, a politician named Robert Walpole engineered a pragmatic workaround. He consolidated the king's executive power into a committee of senior ministers who could manage the country themselves. In doing so, he invented the cabinet system and the role of prime minister out of sheer necessity. Contrast that internal flexibility with how the empire managed its external territories. When the 13 American colonies demanded political representation to match their taxation, Westminster refused to compromise. That rigidity led directly to a grueling war and the permanent loss of the colonies. For the British elite, the loss of America and the success of the new cabinet system provided a blunt lesson. If you ignore pressure, you lose your territory. If you adapt, you maintain your grip on power. By the end of the 18th century, the state was surrounded by existential threats. The French Revolution was exporting radical republican ideas across Europe, and the 1798 Irish Rebellion revealed a geographic vulnerability on Britain's western flank that rival powers were eager to exploit. Prime Minister William Pitt recognized the security risk and engineered the Act of Union in 1800. This legally absorbed Ireland into the United Kingdom, a defensive territorial concession designed to lock down the border against French influence. At the exact same time, the domestic economy was radically shifting. The Industrial Revolution concentrated the workforce into heavy manufacturing. This produced immense wealth for a new class of industrialists, but it also created a vast, densely packed urban working class laboring in hazardous conditions with zero political voice. This map highlights the political imbalance. Explosively growing northern industrial centers like Manchester had absolutely no representation. Meanwhile, mostly empty southern rural districts controlled the voting power. These rotten boroughs allowed a single wealthy landowner to buy a seat with as few as 7 voters. The workers pushed back. Frustration erupted into machine-breaking Luddite protests and large-scale violence, like the 1831 Bristol riots, where troops were deployed against civilians. The country was sitting on the brink of civil war. The industrial engine was producing vast new capital, but it lacked a political release valve. Without a way to vent these grievances legally, the working class was building explosive, revolutionary pressure. Looking across the Channel at the revolutions tearing through Europe, the British ruling class grew terrified. They realized that ignoring the demands of the working class would eventually lead to their own destruction. So Parliament passed the Great Reform Act of 1832. It was not a sudden embrace of democratic ideals. It was a calculated, defensive concession, yielding a fraction of political control to preserve the overall system. This chart tracks the legislative impact. The act deleted 56 rotten boroughs, transferring those seats directly to new industrial towns. The reform increased the electorate by 57%, co-opting the middle class, while deliberately locking out the poorest factory workers and completely excluding women. Over the next 50 years, the working class continued to organize, demanding further rights through movements like Chartism. Parliament responded with the Second and Third Reform Acts in 1867 and 1884, incrementally extending the vote only when public pressure threatened national stability. The gradual democratization of the 19th century was achieved through pragmatic, staged retreats. The elite slowly traded their monopoly on power for domestic peace. By the early 20th century, the strategy of trading political representation for peace reached its absolute limit. In some places, mere reform was no longer enough. Following the 1918 election, Irish Republicans established an independent parliament, triggering the Irish War of Independence. This forced Westminster into its largest territorial concession in centuries, the Government of Ireland Act of 1920, which physically partitioned the island. Domestically, the immense sacrifices demanded by two world wars pushed the British public to their breaking point. After 1945, a collectively traumatized population demanded a heavily revised social contract in exchange for their service. In 1942, economist William Beveridge published a report outlining a comprehensive system of social insurance. His plan targeted what he called the 5 giants of societal ruin: want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness. 3 years after the war, Clement Attlee's Labour government delivered the ultimate social concession. They established the National Health Service, providing free medical care to every citizen, regardless of wealth. The creation of the modern welfare state introduced a new type of shock absorber. The government committed to massive, permanent public expenditure, and in return, it secured profound, long-term social stability. Approaching the turn of the millennium, a new strain emerged. It became increasingly clear that a highly centralized government in London could no longer effectively manage the distinct regional nationalisms growing across the country. In 1997, Prime Minister Tony Blair initiated a policy of devolution, reversing centuries of power consolidation by handing legislative authority back to the regions. This resulted in the creation of the Welsh Assembly and the Scottish Parliament. For the first time since 1707, Scotland had its own dedicated legislative body with the power to manage its internal affairs. The following year produced the Good Friday Agreement, an international treaty designed to end decades of violent sectarian conflict in Northern Ireland. This schematic details the core of the agreement. It mandates a power-sharing structure within the new Stormont Assembly. By law, unionist and nationalist blocs must interlock and govern together to pass legislation, ensuring neither side can dominate the other. Devolution altered the basic mechanics of the United Kingdom. To prevent internal fracturing, it transformed from a highly centralized unitary state into a quasi-federal hybrid. Today, that unwritten constitution is under extreme mechanical tension. Leaving the European Union represents the most severe modern stress test on the devolved settlement. Departing the EU directly disrupted the delicate geopolitical and economic balance that made the Good Friday Agreement possible, particularly the guarantee of an open border on the island of Ireland. To avoid border checkpoints, the government negotiated the Northern Ireland Protocol, moving the customs border into the Irish Sea. This created immediate friction over trade logistics and fierce political anxiety regarding sovereignty. This ongoing friction proves a basic reality about the United Kingdom. It is not a finished, static monument. It is a continuous, high-stakes negotiation. For 300 years, the British state has survived empire, industrialization, and global war by making deals just before the system collapsed. To survive 21st century geopolitical pressures, it must rely on its oldest survival mechanism, the willingness to bend before it breaks.